Hello and welcome to Take the Stand, Inclusive Leaders. I'm Dana Denis-Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of Obelisk Support, a legal services business, and the founder of the first 100 Years Project, which celebrates the achievements of women in law. I'm on a mission to make the legal profession a more inclusive place, and so I've invited legal industry leaders who also care about inclusivity to have a conversation with me. This episode, I'm talking to Stephen Dooley, Deputy Group General Counsel and partner with KPMG, a global professional services firm. Welcome to Take the Stand, Stephen.
I don't know, great to be here.
It's great to have a conversation about inclusive leadership with you. And I wanted to start by asking you, what does inclusive leadership mean to you?
KPMG has a real commitment to inclusive leadership. What that means for me and my team is, as a group, if you look at it, we're very diverse. You know, I've come from teams in the past where it's been a very homogenous environment. Everyone has tended to look the same, think the same, and say the same things. Within the team I've got now, the advantage of a heterogeneous environment is you get different ways of thinking, you get different approaches to the same problem. And that's a massive strength. But at the same time, creating an environment like that, being committed to building up a group which does think differently is a constant challenge, because we all like comfort. We all like hearing people say, yes, you're right. And in an inclusive environment, you've actually got to have people saying, what about this and what about that? Because their perspective will be different from yours. And in our case, we also have the interesting aspect that half of our team are actually based in India. So we have a different way of working, we have a different approach. There are absolutely things that we have learned from them. They are far more structured, they embody sort of capture of knowledge of what they do far better than we do. And it's fascinating looking at how they address problems differently and ensuring that we get the optimum solution to everything that we deal with.
I think that's great. Also, it's a great example to talk about, this kind of cultural aspect of inclusivity that, we often think about inclusivity from a kind of what we see around and making sure we are putting our arms around everybody. But actually, when you work across continents in a global business and with teams that are based in different countries, that kind of cultural inclusivity is as important as, gender inclusivity or race inclusivity. So it's great that you've given us that example. So to just follow to the next question, I'd love us to hear from you about what you think are the top qualities of an inclusive leader. I know you reflect a lot on leadership, so good leadership is one thing, but what are 2 or 3 qualities that you think will make an inclusive leader?
Get the best person for the job. And what I mean by that is, I found that when you're interviewing people, or even before then, when you're looking at CVs, one of the interesting things was how you actually read a CV. If you remove things such as the name and the school and the university, it actually makes you focus on different parts of your CV. So for me, building up a team that was inclusive actually meant, looking at how we thought about things, but what biases effectively we bring to the table, what stories we create in our heads from little snippets of information. I think you've also got to actually embrace challenge. We're often in environments where, again, we want to be told that we're correct. We want to hear people agreeing with us. Inclusive leadership does not involve just having people saying, yes, you're right. For one thing, I think you need to be very conscious of the role that you play. Don't be the first person to express a view if you are the decision maker, if you are the nominated leader. You've got to be careful to draw out the views of everybody. And that's not just the 1 or 2 people in the room who want to talk. In any group, there's always a few people who, they're great. They have the energy, they have the challenge. But you need to be very aware that in a room, there are those who are going to want to assess the opinions of others before they contribute. You've also got people who will be maybe reticent because English is not their first language, or they feel that they are inexperienced and they don't want to it is a quality in lawyers. They're the opposite of academics. Academics are convinced that their opinion is right and everybody else is wrong. Lawyers always seem to operate on this sort of, they want to make sure they understand what everybody else thinks before they jump in. So I think one of the qualities of leadership is draw people's views out, because it's not the person who makes the most noise is necessarily the smartest or the one who's right. So you've got to look for those who are not putting themselves forward and find the right way for them to contribute. It may even be a case of they don't want to contribute in the meeting, but in which case reach out afterwards and get their opinion.
It's a really great example. So my next question is then, what is an example of your inclusive leadership in practice, your style? So, an example of something you've done that could bring to life how you lead as an inclusive leader.
I think it's been a case of almost trying to understand what I'm good at and what I'm bad at. And I don't have the ability to bound upon a stage and give an inspiring speech. There've been a couple of occasions where I had to reorganize teams and to bring them together. And it troubled me because I knew I wouldn't be able to, stand in front of a crowd and, lead them cheering to the future. But I tried to think, what can I do? What am I better at doing? And for me, it's establishing one-on-one relationships. So to solve the problem of bringing people with me, the way I decided to approach it was to speak to every individual privately and actually say, right, what is it that you want from this change? And having established that, how are we going to achieve it? And the beauty of something like that is by asking them the question, it makes them reflect upon their role in what's happening, but also then how are we going to change that? To an extent, it's assuming that they are going to then be part of that change. But by doing it one-on-one, it was able to sort of play into what I feel comfortable with. And it's also a chance for everybody to express a view. So that's one way I think I've approached things. The other way is, I think every leader needs to monitor their own emotional state quite carefully, because how we deal with things depends on how the person that we are interacting with is feeling and how we feel ourselves. It's really easy to just go in and assume that people are unaffected by situations. I remember I used to work at what was CSC Computer Sciences, it's now DXC, and speaking to a fairly influential figure when there were various stresses in the organization. And the most effective question you can ask is actually, how are you doing? Because we kind of assume that everybody else is able to deal with these problems, particularly if they are above us in the hierarchy. They're fine, they know how to handle these things, but very often they've got great stresses on them. And asking the simple question, how are you feeling, is actually very rarely asked in a way that's intentional. We say, how are you? But we don't really care about the answer. But actually sort of, how are you feeling? And then listening to the answer is a hugely valuable part of leadership, in my view.
I actually like this idea of the kind of very quite high touch kind of leadership style where, you take the interest in the individual, not just the collective. That sounds like a really different way compared to other people that I've spoken to. So it's great to have that style described, and definitely the emotional checks. But leaders are people too, right? So that's kind of the balance. So sometimes it's quite helpful when people also ask the leader how they feel, but sometimes that question doesn't really find its way up. But
It
yeah.
is a really important one to ask sometimes, because you will be amazed how often, if you ask the question meaningfully and actually sort of try to drag the answer out, they're not doing okay. There is the assumption that these people they're well paid, they're secure in their jobs, they should be absolutely fine. And then you find out that people have been losing sleep, agonizing about certain decisions, that things are going really badly, that they're feeling under pressure. It's amazing the conversations that you will have just from a simple question like that.
You mentioned a little bit in passing about, other places where you've seen kind of inclusivity or leadership in practice. I want to ask you if you can share with us an experience of inclusive leadership that you came across in your career that really influenced your career journey, and why do you think it mattered to you so much?
I think I was really lucky at the beginning of my career in that I worked for a very small firm, and the person in charge of my training contract was a fantastic lawyer named Christine Reed. And the great thing about her was she's quite iconoclastic. There was no concept of hierarchy, and she would challenge you at every turn. It was, if you had a view, she would listen to it, but then there would be challenge. She was also very, very plain speaking. So if I made a mistake, and believe me, I made plenty, you would be told that, and it wouldn't matter whether it was a mistake in your day job or in interactions. She'd actually say, I saw this, just so you know, are you aware of these circumstances? And I would have done that. And that was really helpful. But I think the best example of leadership I ever saw, and it almost left me with my jaw on the floor, was a chap called David Gray. And he and I worked in the same organization. He was not someone I technically reported into, but then after a reorganization and various changes, I was going to be effectively reporting to him. And we'd never quite got on. And I was never sure why. We just didn't have that comfortable relationship. There was always an element of challenge. And the most effective moment of leadership I ever saw was he came into my room, and initially there was a degree of, shall we say, caution on my part. Don't know why he's come into my room. He wants to have a talk. This is probably not going to be good for me. And it starts off in a sort of slightly confrontational fashion. And he said, Stephen, we're going to be working far more closely now than we used to in the past, and obviously we've never got on particularly well. So there's one thing you need to understand about me. At this point, I'm ready for a fight. It's not going to go well. And he said, you need to understand I'm an idiot. And at that point, I was floored. I didn't know how to respond. I mean, part of me thinking, okay, that's not the statement I was ever expecting you to say. And he simply said, we've never got on well. I've thought about this, and I don't understand the reason. There's no good reason. We've just had various interactions. And he said, I've reflected on it, and it's actually, you remind me of someone I don't like. And that was actually genius, because this relationship I've been worried about. I was going to report to someone who, for the first time in my life, I actively thought I would have a problem with. And by reflecting and then engaging in a really open way, he utterly disarmed me. We had a fantastically good conversation, examining each other's backgrounds, the assumptions we had made about each other, the triggers that we had both had. And to me, that was just phenomenally good man management. The fact that he'd analysed his own position, he'd thought about it, reflected, come into my rooms, in other words, moved into my territory, which in his view was trying to make me more comfortable, certainly more so than being summoned to see the boss, which nobody likes. It was really, really cleverly done, and I admire his approach and his commitment to individual man management, which was amongst the best I've ever seen.
Fabulous example, really. Actually, two examples you had. So that's really, really great to hear. And so it kind of leads to my next question, because obviously kind of perceptions and ideas, as you said, making assumptions about what you think the other person or the other persons are like, creates a non-inclusive headspace almost. So my next question is about taking down the barriers around creating inclusivity. So what do you think is the biggest barrier to having more inclusivity?
We create stories in our heads. We create the stories of our own origins and our own experiences. And too often we either create stories for other people based on very insufficient information. You know, we will see them do one thing and we'll create a narrative about it. Or we just assume that their story is the same as ours. And that's a huge mistake. You know, we'll look at one or two characteristics that we have in common and therefore think, you and I are the same, or you and I are different, and you fit into this category and I fit into that category. You need to have, I think, the conversations to understand where people come from. You need to let people take their own time. You can't be invasive, but it is good quality conversations for me. It's understanding their perspectives, and it's actually assuming that there is a validity to everything they've seen, which has led them to their conclusions. You may not agree with it. You may never agree with some positions, but it doesn't mean that they're invalid. They will be justified from the experiences that somebody else has had. And I think it's that degree of openness which is hugely important. So it's respect for their experience.
What is the one question do you think somebody who wants to become an inclusive leader should ask himself or herself? Just the one question.
I think it's probably, do I care enough? You cannot, in my view, be a truly effective leader unless you care about the people whom you lead. And if I can kind of give a second coda to that, I know you said the one thing, but the second thing is probably understand the purpose of the team that you're leading. Because too often we're just doing our job, but you know, what is your aim? Are you trying to protect the business and ensure that it doesn't take any risk? Are you trying to help it grow? You know, how you answer that will probably influence how you approach problems. But for me, the most important thing is if you lead a team, then you're a hugely influential person in the lives of other people. What you do, what you say, and how you act, it affects their day. When people go home, you have the possibility of impacting that for good or ill. So you've got to care about anybody where you're in a position of leadership. It's a position of responsibility and accountability, but you're responsible and accountable to your team first and foremost, in my view.
And I want to ask you, who is your inclusive leadership role model? It doesn't need to be somebody from the legal profession. It can be from anywhere.
You know, an obvious example for me is someone like Barack Obama, who approached every situation on the worth of the individual and the contribution that they made, you know, regardless of, so far as I'm aware, you know, status, regardless of position. It's what are they bringing at this moment. So that's you know, maybe too easy a choice. I think also if you look at some of the great sports leaders, you know, the really great teams are led by managers that are empathic, that really care about individuals. So that to me, in fact, you know, look at Ben Stokes in the cricket world right now. There's someone who seems to have the ability to connect with every individual, to bring out the best of them, to operate with a degree of joy in what they're doing, and yet at the same time to put an arm around people who are suffering. You know, the openness with which you hear issues like mental health discussed. The idea of that happening years ago is just beyond belief, and yet it's such an important part of life. You know, understanding people's mental welfare and how that impacts their ability to perform, to operate, is important, but it's also the compassion, the concern about the individual. So again, naming a famous sports figure may be a bit of a cop-out, but if you look at Ben Stokes and the way the England cricket team operates now, it is amazing.
I think they're great examples, actually, both of them, and it's nice because they are from different spheres and they, equally impactful, I guess. To our viewers, I hope you found this conversation interesting and useful, and it's given you plenty of ideas for making your workplace, your team, and organization more inclusive. To find more conversations on inclusivity, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Obelisk Support, or connect with me on LinkedIn, searching Dana Denis-Smith and heading to my video section. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch by email at d.denis-smith@obelisksupport.com. Thank you for listening and for watching and joining Take the Stand, Inclusive Leaders. See you next time.